Hello everyone, I'm glad that you're back for another informational video. In this video, we will revisit evidence-based practices within special education. We'll discuss what they are, how they are established, and what benefits they bring to students. Specifically, I will go over behavior management interventions and how they can be used by adaptive physical educators to promote student success. Lastly, we will visit the topic of curriculum development for kids in adaptive physical education. As always, you can find the sources I use to bring you information in the description of each video. Let's get right into it. Evidence-based practices are different from research-based practices or best practices according to a 2009 article by Cook et al. In that EBPs are supported by a sufficient number of studies that are of high methodological quality, use appropriate research designs that allow for assessment of effectiveness, and demonstrate meaningful effect sizes such that they merit educators' trust that the practice works. So as you can see, EBPs are identified using a careful selection process, greatly adding to their reliability in the field of special education. Well, that varies depending on which we are talking about. I will link a couple of videos above so you can see some examples of EBPs I went into detail about in the past. Generally speaking, however, these interventions are meant to improve the lives of students with various learning differences or physical disabilities. EBPs help us either discourage unwanted behavior or encourage desirable behaviors. They may be used to teach a student how to communicate better with others or be more independent or learn new skills. All of these techniques ultimately increase the number of opportunities for differently able children to be successful alongside typically developing peers or in special education classrooms, and help prepare these students for life beyond school. I will share with you all a few links to organizations which are dedicated to researching and identifying evidence-based practices. These organizations offer many additional services that may be helpful, such as training for teachers or parents, specific lesson plans using established interventions, and services for families and children, such as early intervention, evaluations, and treatments. You can find the list of these links in the description. I also want to point out a great research article by Andrew Ecker, where the author reviewed 13 trustworthy websites and compiled a list of EBPs for us, organized into the following 6 categories. Within these categories, the EBPs are further sorted by students' age and need. This is a very convenient resource for educators seeking specific interventions. Next, let's talk about behavior management interventions, as they are important to all educators in a variety of settings. The behavioral intervention category is a big one. It includes many smaller interventions within it that are often used together, such as pre-teaching, prompting, and positive reinforcement. There are many combinations of these smaller components that make up an intervention that range from 1 to over 4 in a single study. I will show you each of these category lists, and for the sake of time, I will only go into more detail about one intervention from each list. Let's start with some examples of behavioral interventions consisting of one component. Let's take a look at chaining and how an adapted PE teacher might use this to help a student in their class. Chaining is a process of breaking down a complex task into smaller, more manageable parts and teaching them to a student in the appropriate order to build up to performing a complex task. For example, if I was teaching a dance class, I would want to break up the dance routine into sections and then break down those sections into specific steps, which is where I would begin teaching my class to eventually have them perform the entire complex dance routine. The same strategy can be used to teach skills not associated with PE, such as daily tasks like getting dressed, packing a backpack, or brushing teeth. This list displays examples of interventions composed of 2 to 3 components. I'll go ahead and describe the intervention that I used as an example earlier: pre-teaching, prompting, and positive reinforcement. I'll describe pre-teaching and positive reinforcement first using a study by Greenwald et al. From 2014, where the desired outcome was to reduce the amount of unwanted behavior by an 8-year-old girl with autism while at the grocery store, specifically tantrums, when she didn't get something she wanted. Pre-teaching consisted of the mom progressively teaching her daughter at home to first read items off index cards, then identify them, and finish by putting them in the cart, followed by a reward for doing it correctly. This process lasted for 2 weeks, and once the child was familiarized with the desired behavior, she was once again brought to the grocery store to test her new skills in a real-life setting. The little girl successfully completed the desired tasks and was subsequently rewarded with her favorite snack, which is the positive reinforcement component. Finally, prompting is the act of providing a cue to a student to trigger them to perform a desired action. The cue might be a word, gesture, or an action like pointing to a piece of paper and asking a child to write their name. So how might an adapted PE teacher use pre-teaching, prompting, and positive reinforcement during their class? If I was teaching tennis, for example, and I wanted to help a student who was struggling, I might spend some time first teaching that student how to swing the racket. Then I might advance to throwing a ball in their direction and teaching them to hit it with the racket. The process could take hours or days. Once the student seems comfortable with the task, I would pair them with a peer and prompt them to repeat the same steps they already learned. Once the student successfully completed the task, I would positively reinforce them in some way they prefer. Maybe a high five, a great job, or a gold star. This last list represents examples of behavioral interventions which consist of 4 or more components. Let's break down the second intervention on the list: modeling, prompting, reinforcement, redirection, and abolishing operation. Modeling is much like it sounds. It is where the student observes someone modeling the desired behavior performed correctly to them prior to the student attempting it. You already know what prompting and reinforcement are. Redirection is part of response interruption / redirection component. This is a method to discourage unwanted behavior the subject enjoys doing, usually such that is repetitive or sometimes harmful, like body rocking, grunting, or hitting themselves. The teacher would interrupt the behavior when it begins and redirect the student's attention to something else, such as a desired behavior. Abolishing operation component is another strategy which seeks to reduce repetitive, stereotypic behaviors just mentioned by reducing or eliminating the effects of the reinforcer, which perpetuates the behavior. An example from a study by Lang et al. In 2010 was using the component in addition to an intervention to reduce unwanted behavior while promoting normative play behavior in a child with autism. The unwanted behavior was the repeated swinging of a toy in front of the eyes of the participant, while the desired behavior would be appropriate types of play with the toy modeled by the therapist in the study. The hypothesis was that if the child was allowed to indulge in their preferred stereotypic behavior until satiation, then the reinforcer stimulus, which makes the child want to perform that behavior, would have less impact. This would in turn help the participant be more receptive to the play intervention. The result was the addition of the abolishing operation component successfully improved overall results of the intervention. So how can the entire intervention of modeling, prompting, reinforcement, redirection, and abolishing operation be used in a PE context? Well, say one of my students loved to spin around a lot. This may not be ideal if the class was in the middle of stretching post their activity, for example. What I might do then is, prior to calling everyone in to stretch, I would allow the particular student to spin safely under the supervision of a TA or a volunteer until they were satisfied. We are assuming this would not take more than a few minutes, or my strategy may need to change. I would then call the class in to stretch immediately in order to maximize the time my student has until they want to continue their stereotypic behavior. The same volunteer or TA will proceed to model the stretches that the whole class is doing to the student they are supervising. The TA will prompt the student as needed to perform the desired actions and reinforce appropriate behavior in a way that the student prefers. Should the spinning begin again, the TA will interrupt the behavior and redirect the student's attention back to stretching. As adapted PE educators, we want to create curricula that lead to physical literacy and desired outcomes for every student. We can look to the National Physical Education Standards for a list of student outcomes to guide us in the design of our PE programs that will benefit all students. Whether we have an inclusive classroom with just a couple of children with individualized education programs, or we have a full class of kids with differing abilities, we must take each child and their individual goals and needs into account when designing PE programs that will lead to the outcomes you just saw. The individual goals associated with IEPs should be created by the IEP team using appropriate assessments to determine the child's current abilities and placement needs. Once the curriculum is created, it is the responsibility of each educator to make sure that every child's accommodation needs are met so that they can take full advantage of the learning opportunities presented in class. The adapted PE teacher must also develop an evaluative process to be implemented at specific intervals throughout the school year to gauge the effectiveness of the PE program based on student progress toward general outcomes as well as individual goals. This is the way we can make sure that each student benefits from our instruction. We have come to the end of this video, and as always, thank you for taking the time to watch this. I hope it was helpful. Reach out with any questions and feel free to explore the references below.